This is the weirdest chord in history. It's commonly in use, no one really knows why its variations are named after countries, and it doesn't have a clear root. It's a case study in the history of music theory, and a window into how our theoretical methodologies, however insightful, will never constitute a complete theory of everything. I'm the classical nerd, and today we're talking about the augmented sixth chord. Technically speaking, the augmented sixth refers to a specific type of interval that takes a major sixth and expands it by one half step, either by sharpening the upper note or, less commonly, flattening the lower note. It's inharmonically equivalent to the minor seventh. That is, they sound the same, but they have different functions. This is analogous to the linguistic concept of the homophone. This means that they mean different things. Think of the augmented sixth as your, and the minor seventh as your. Spelling is important because of the way that voice leading works. The tritone, depending on how it's spelled, either compresses into a major third, or outwards to a minor sixth. This is good voice leading because there's strong resolution in stepwise motion from a dissonance to a consonance. The augmented sixth works the same way. By spelling it as an augmented sixth, you get half-step motion out to the octave. Why not just spell it as a minor seventh then? It's sort of like using the wrong your in a sentence. When you hear it, in context, everybody knows what you're saying, but in order to show that's what you mean, you have to spell it correctly. You don't move between two versions of the same note if you don't have to. So if I build an augmented sixth from C, the A sharp moves to B, and the C moves down to B. If I build it as a minor seventh instead, and then pretend like it's going to resolve like an augmented sixth, I have to move a B flat to a B natural. You're not moving by half step, you're moving by an augmented unison. This, however, sets up a major problem for theorists, who postulated a series of frameworks in an attempt to explain why and how chords that use this interval worked. It was a thorn in theorists' sides because chords have roots, right? Well, not so fast. When theorists refer to the augmented sixth, they rarely refer to the interval in the abstract, rather one of a family of chords which share two common properties, the tonic of whatever key you're in, and an augmented sixth that resolves outwards to the dominant of whatever key you're in. So this barebones C to A sharp would form the backbone of an augmented sixth chord that resolves to B, which is the dominant of E. So add E to C and A sharp, and you get the most basic augmented sixth chord. Today, augmented sixths are taught as coming in three distinct varieties: the Italian, the French, and the German. While I am going to be making use of these national labels to refer to these specific chords, there is only the flimsiest of historical cases to be made for why they're called this. The basic augmented sixth chord is known as the Italian sixth, most frequently flat 6, 1, and sharp 4 of a given key. The other national chords just add an extra note onto this. Add 2 and you get the French sixth. Add flat 3 and you get the German sixth. Now all three of these have unique properties because of their tendency to resolve to the dominant. The French sixth allows for a common tone between itself and the dominant to which it's going, while the German sixth is inharmonically equivalent to the dominant seventh. This requires a two-step process of resolution, going through an intermediate chord known as the cadential 6-4. Sometimes you'll see composers, even Mozart, leading directly from the German sixth to the dominant, but the resulting parallel fifths can be pretty jarring. We'll look at a Mozart example that does this a little later on, trust me. The German sixth also exists in an inharmonic version, sometimes called the doubly augmented, after the bizarre-looking fourth squeezed in here, which is sometimes used to clarify the voice leading when used in a major key context. If you're in E minor, it makes sense for the G to be held over to the cadential 6-4, but if you're in E major, F double sharp leads up to a G sharp. The upside is this makes sense in the right context. The bad news is, sometimes you get F double sharps, which is more than enough to ruin anyone's afternoon. In practical terms, the German and French sixth took prominence in different eras more so than different countries. But why are they even called this in the first place? Well, the practice of naming a chord after a certain place isn't uncommon. The Neapolitan chord, often called the Neapolitan sixth since it's most commonly found in first inversion, was popularized by opera composers from Naples, Italy, and became stereotypically associated with that sound. But composers around Europe went to Italy for training and would translate their names into Italian to get in the running for more prestigious jobs. The Neapolitans didn't invent it. There are examples from the Netherlands 2 centuries before that term came into use. The Italian sixth may very well have originated somewhere on the Italian peninsula, but it's more likely a form of musical stereotyping. As far as anyone can tell, these names trace their origins to the early 19th century, to a book called Grammar of Music, published by an Englishman named John Calcott in 1806. Calcott's references talk about these chords, but don't put national labels on them. They just appear in his volume. Whether or not Calcott is to blame for originating this silliness may never truly be known, but he was responsible for spreading it, since his book was a widely circulated pocket reference. If Calcott believed that the augmented sixth was of Italian provenance, it suffices that the chord's most basic or original version would be credited to them. As for the other two, the German sixth emphasized fully voiced chords and logical voice leading, which may have reminded Calcott of the emphasis on tonal logic and textbook counterpoint that formed a core element of the German symphonic tradition. The French sixth at the time was the runt of the augmented sixth litter, so the long-standing feud between England and France may have been behind this appellation. But its overlap with the whole tone scale, popularized by Debussy about a century later, makes this chord sound French to a lot of students. The augmented sixth can be conceived as a flattened element and a sharpened element, with the flattened element most commonly in the bass. This is because the augmented sixth traces its origins to the Phrygian cadence, something that we've retained as a term to refer to a half cadence where the bass moves down a half step. In modal music, composers would exploit the half step between the first 2 notes of the Phrygian mode to get what we might call an upper leading tone. Modal counterpoint dictated that you need a major sixth going to an octave at cadences, so this works. You don't need a conventional leading tone. But other modes, like Dorian for instance, don't have an upper or a lower leading tone. They have a minor sixth. To give cadences a sense of finality and arrival, performers would alter certain notes in order to get that major sixth, most commonly by creating what we would call a leading tone. This was part of a medieval and Renaissance performance practice known as Musica Ficta. This C-sharp didn't really exist in the theory of their time, not in the way that we think of it. But performers on these upper parts became so used to creating what we would call a leading tone that they would accidentally do it in Phrygian, a mode where major sixth was already present. Renaissance theorists acknowledged the resulting augmented sixth as a theoretical possibility, but forbade its use because it sounded too spicy. The expressiveness of the Baroque era, which historians date handily enough to 1600, began to allow the kinds of things that strict Renaissance procedure banned, such as the diminished third as an expressive interval, as the half step below and above a target note. While augmented sixths show up in the scores of some late Renaissance composers like William Byrd, note that this is expressive, explicitly tied to text, and the E-sharp here is optional. The majority of the recordings I found did not include this inflection, but I prefer it with. This piece barely qualifies as Renaissance because the Baroque era fully kicked off when Monteverdi in a treatise said, "I can do what I want, so long as I can justify it expressively." So a lot of examples in the Baroque literature come from vocal music, where you could justify dissonances using the text. Nevertheless, for the first century or so of the augmented sixth's traceable use in Baroque music, composers were very careful with how they used it, initially introducing it as a series of passing tones, sometimes avoiding sounding the tones of the augmented sixth at exactly the same time. The augmented sixth chromaticizes, and thus intensifies, the motion to an octave. If we look at the augmented sixth as something that intensifies something else, there's nothing stopping us from applying this principle of adding extra chromaticism to intensify motion to other consonances. Charpentier's 1861 oratorio, Mors Saoulis et Jonete, I'm sorry for the pronunciation there, combined the augmented sixth with the augmented octave, an astonishing interval that resolves to the 10th. This is a Phrygian cadence just dripping with the extra juice of chromatic inflection. Augmented sixth chords combine the Phrygian cadence with the characteristic sharpened fourth degree borrowed from the secondary dominant. This is an especially good explanation for the French sixth. If you rearrange it into something resembling root position, and then take out all the accidentals, you get a 2-7 chord. While 2-7 chords often appear in their own right, its two most powerful siblings are 5-7-5, which sharpens scale degree 4, and 2 half-diminished 7, which flattens scale degree 6. If you do both of these at the same time, you take the two elements of both of those chords, which makes them so powerful, and you smash them together. The issue, of course, is that when you do this, you're completely left out in the cold to explain the root, because all of a sudden, what looks like the root doesn't sound like one. At the very end of the 17th century, composer Georg Muffat took what he learned from his studies around Europe and was among the first to compile examples of how composers used the augmented sixth. He noted that it was only used by a few Italian composers, and only if the text they were setting called for extra expressivity. The term in use in that day was the false large sixth, but by the early part of the 18th century, its popularity boomed, likely in no small part to composers around Europe attempting to imitate the Italian style. And yet, as composers advanced their uses, two of the biggest names in theory of the day, Jean-Philippe Rameau and Johann Joseph Fuchs, themselves composers, were dismissive. Theory was at a crossroads, as some, like Rameau, emphasized the vertical, thinking of music harmonically as a series of identifiable chords with identifiable roots. Fuchs, on the other hand, was extremely old-fashioned, emphasizing the horizontal and contrapuntal aspect of music making. Augmented sixth were the only chords then utilized which problematized Rameau's theories of fundamental bass. Instead of twisting his thesis to find an explanation, it was easier for Rameau to be dismissive of the chord as simply the result of passing motion. Fuchs doesn't allow it under any circumstance, because he was an old putz who couldn't put up with even a mild dissonance, and probably would have exploded if you played him an Ornette Coleman record. For both, the problem of the chord was something far deeper than either of them would explain. Augmented sixth chords don't really have roots. Or rather, there are several competing explanations for how the chord works, and what its roots might be. But to understand the rootless argument, we need to untangle some chords. Rameau really popularized the idea of tracking harmony through root movement, which streamlined the clunky figured bass notation theretofore used. The root is the lowest note of a stack of major and or minor thirds, so consider the Italian sixth, which looks like it could be inverted to F sharp A flat C, an F minor chord with a raised root. Problem is, this chord doesn't sound like a triad. That's because inverting the augmented sixth gets a diminished third, and only major and minor thirds work in this system. Diminished thirds are inharmonically equivalent to major seconds. The problem doesn't go away with the French sixth either, since the diminished third is still crammed in there. The German sixth, in its more traditional format, turns out to have a root position that sounds like a dominant seventh and third inversion, its least stable form. This is no good. Theorists had this basic assumption that all chords had to have roots, like they had to. If they didn't, it would throw a major wrench into their collective search for the ultimate system of musical analysis. Augmented sixths just don't fit, at least not easily. If music theory were the laws of the universe, the augmented sixth was dividing by zero. So solution one is to say, yeah, screw it. They're just bizarre chords that work best in weird inversions. As we've seen, this doesn't hold water. You can't claim universal truth if said truth has an exception. Theorists just didn't want to give up the pithy truthiness of the idea that all chords had roots, and from approximately 1680 to 1911 wove a whole web of competing theories, each seemingly more contorted and bizarre than the last. And it's because composers were treating this chord not just as passing, but as a full-fledged harmony. By 1640, we start to see this suspension figure. Now, the resolution of a suspension should be a consonance, and yet in this case, it's not. You just cannot explain this as a result of passing motion. An alternative to the textbook definition of root position as a harmonic stack of major and or minor thirds is to think of it more broadly, as what's the most logical and straightforward arrangement of this chord? For most triads, root position is this arrangement. So a chord known for its use of the augmented sixth should be placed in an inversion which privileges the augmented sixth. Enter Rousseau, who believed that the chord had to be built on the flat submediant. But this neither explains nor solves our root problem. This isn't an explanation which works with the harmonic theorization that explains other triads. The implication is that the augmented sixth is some kind of flat sixth chord. Other theorists propose the idea of a missing root, coming to the conclusion that the augmented sixth was the leftover upper structure of some lower note that was never sounded, specifically the 2 chord, a common predominant harmony. But the problem was that scale degree 2 only crops up in the French sixth, which was the least utilized of the 3 major varieties for about the first century and a half of theoretical analysis. And we've already talked about how the French sixth still has problems if you put scale degree 2 in the bass. It's a real uphill battle to make the root of your chord the most important note, something that's not even in the chord to begin with. Nevertheless, since the alternatives were somehow even more unsatisfactory, many otherwise respected theorists threw their hat into the ring of the false root theory. Since 2 is a predominant harmony, and so are augmented sixths, they have the same harmonic function, but this doesn't mean that they have the same root. By the time we get to Bach's heyday in the early to mid 1700s, the use of the augmented sixth had undergone a major shift. Note how Bach uses the alto line here to move through all 3 major varieties. Prior to the 1720s, it tended to show up in Italian composers' works, but Italian composers were sought after around Europe. This first encouraged imitation of the Italians, but within a generation, the loan word became a core part of others' vocabularies, and theorists remained startled by how effectively it repelled their analyses. Enter Marperk. He believed that these chords' roots were their sharpened note, although he noted that their standard usage was otherwise. But critically, Marperk introduced the idea that the augmented sixth was related to the diminished seventh, which is inharmonic to the major sixth. The diminished seventh looks like a seventh, but it sounds like a sixth, whereas the augmented sixth looks like a sixth, but sounds like a seventh, so they're kind of opposites. Marperk proposed the existence of something he called a double diminished triad. What I think he means is that this looks like a triad, but it contains a diminished fifth and a diminished third. Add an A onto this chord and boom, you've got all the notes of a French sixth. The confusing part is the fact that doubly diminished is a rare, but possible, quality for an interval to have. This is a doubly diminished fifth. But we'll look past that because, it doesn't have anything to do with the diminished seventh. It doesn't matter how you compare these 2 chords. For this video, I checked out a book literally all about this chord, tracing its development through history, and even though this book does a really good job of translating and explaining, I have no idea what Marperk is on about here. He uses a more circuitous and more confusing route, and he ends up at, the same exact dead end. And here's the most bizarre thing. No one had any better explanation, so they just built off of Marperk and, tried to make it make sense. One of the people who agree with Marperk was Albrechtsberger, a composer best known for teaching counterpoint to Beethoven when Haydn wouldn't return his texts. As more of a contrapuntal than harmonic theorist, Albrechtsberger had derived his own system of teaching counterpoint, which was more amenable to the chromatic music written at the time. So how did these 2 end up agreeing on something as stupid as this? Who's to say? A contemporary translation added commentary. The minor third and the diminished third are 2 intervals that have nothing in common. It is of importance not to confound them. Okay, I don't want to spend too much of my time laughing at dead music theorists. The living ones are funny enough. To Albrechtsberger's credit, he understood the harmonic sleight of hand that these chords represented like no one before him, offering up examples of inharmonic modulation where a 5-7 chord is interpreted as a German sixth, leading to a very distant key area, inharmonically flat 2 or the Neapolitan. The spelling as sharp 1 is in the original. But even though not everyone was convinced that the diminished seventh idea held water, one more major theorist wanted to take a crack at it. The lawyer Gottfried Weber. He sought to rigorously systematize the discipline, to mixed results. Weber popularized Roman numerals as analytical shorthand and defined 7 distinct chordal sonorities. Nothing in the musical discipline was beyond his almost taxonomical approach. He took the 4 chord in major, raised its root to get a diminished sharp 4, and then borrowed the flat submediant scale degree from minor. Notwithstanding that this is an 8th type of sonority, Weber believed he'd cracked the case. Weber could get away with explaining this because the standard explanation for the diminished 7th chord was that it was just a 9th chord without a root. But since he's explaining these in the context of missing roots, they can never be in root position because there's no root. For instance, if you have a dominant ninth and you take away the root, you don't get a rootless dominant chord, just a 7 diminished 7. Like we saw earlier, it's the same harmonic function, but that doesn't mean they have the same root. The modern notion that augmented sixth chords lead to the dominant of the key began to solidify in the classical era, as the tonic-dominant relationship became a structural element in classical composition. It became more and more common to treat augmented sixth as predominant chords until it became standard practice when the chord was taught. As sonata form evolved, composers learned to reserve augmented sixths for either the introduction of the second theme in the exposition or the transition into the recapitulation. However, although the location within a movement was fixed, classical era composers found novelty in how they used them, either forming a new chord by sharpening the fifth of a dominant seventh, or leading to it from a Neapolitan chord in second inversion. The 5/7 took a familiar dominant sonority and added this ultra-chromatic kick. The Neapolitan 6/4 was much rarer, since 6/4 chords were considered dissonant, so composers had fewer ways to lead into them using proper voice leading. Composers found that the best way to lead into the augmented sixth via common tone was with a chord that contained flat 6, more commonly 4/6 or 6 in minor. Let's hear a couple of these in context, shall we? First, here's an example of the inharmonic German sixth mentioned earlier. Note how Schumann uses a descending bass to expand the cadential 6/4, and since it's in major, he wants to keep the voice leading clear by using the doubly augmented fourth between, in this case, B flat and E sharp. Just saying that sounds gross. Moving back in history a tad, here's an inverse example, where Mozart doesn't use a cadential 6/4, despite using the German sixth. The outer notes of the middle string figurations show the parallel fifths, but because the outwards resolution of the augmented sixth in the violas is so strong, Mozart is telling us that he thinks it overpowers the parallel fifths. Parallels were okay as long as they didn't stick out. The very fact they almost always stick out is why theory students are told to avoid them to this day. Mozart avoids putting the fifth in the outer voices, where it would be very noticeable. They're called Mozart fifths, Schoenberg would later say, not because they sound good, but because Mozart wrote them, and theorists will always carve out exceptions for revered composers. Finally, here's my single favorite use of the augmented sixth from this era, from the same year as the Mozart. The violin unfurls a beautiful stream of notes on top of, at first, a deceptive cadence to 6, which serves as a common tone to the German sixth. Haydn also avoids parallelism by resolving the cello before everyone else, leading to suspensions of previous chord tones in the middle strings and the unfortunately named retardation on top, which in this case is basically a suspension which resolves upwards instead of downwards. These are all examples of the German sixth, ultimately, because it affords composers so many opportunities. As history unfolded, they expanded their use of the augmented sixth in inversion, and it also began to appear as built on more scale degrees for sudden modulations. Beethoven even used one to start, signaling the end of the practice of using them at very specific points in sonata form. Note that in a 4-part texture, the tonic, F sharp, is doubled, for good voice leading reasons, but this is still a normal Italian sixth. Fast forward to the famous string quartet in C sharp minor, opus 131, and Beethoven gives us a German sixth in inversion and treats the home key of the piece as the local dominant, which is eventually reinterpreted as the leading tone as it moves into the next movement. As harmony evolved in practice, theorists were still desperate to track and codify these rules. Alfred Day's 1845 treatise on harmony offered up the idea that augmented sixths are built off of primary and secondary roots. D flat would be a minor ninth above missing root number 1, C, while B is a major third above missing root number 2, G. This caused problems for Day when he combined this theoretical system with a letter-based system for inversions, A being root position, B being first inversion, etc. So for him, augmented sixths were inversion E, since they're built a minor ninth above the primary root, which is also missing. Believe me, I've worded and reworded this sentence several times over, and I still don't understand why this needs to happen. My best guess is that this is what happens when you let someone who is super into homeopathy try music theory. It is just as discombobulated. The only good thing to say about this idea is that he allowed for a more expanded view of the augmented sixth since it was being freed from its predominant usage, but his system didn't allow for inversions like we just saw in the Beethoven quartet. The need for systemization was spurred on by composers' continual use, as the Romantic era enjoyed a proliferation of augmented sixths to flesh out entire pieces. Schumann's Am leuchtenden Sommermorgen builds a full 30% of its content on a per measure basis from augmented sixths. As the classical era gave way to the Romantic more fully, the French sixth finally found its place in the limelight. Its ambiguity and weirdness made it ripe for exploration. Composers prized its lush whole toniness and explored it as a sonority while putting it in some very novel contexts. Take a look at this Chopin Mazurka, where he uses a French sixth to cadence in E flat. The predominant association of the augmented sixth means that we kind of expect this to lead to 5. So in turn, we kind of hear this E flat as the dominant at first, but Chopin then cadences in E flat in a way that reinforces it as the local tonic and rhythmically de-emphasizes the downbeat in typical Mazurka fashion. Then he uses a common tone modulation to move directly from E flat back to B. Despite the rustic feel provided by the fifths and the bass, it's a harmonically slippery little passage, and note how the French sixth is inflected by this neighbor tone. The emphasis on the French sixth culminated in Richard Wagner's famous Tristan chord. The chord in itself as a sonority is pretty, but it's hardly unique to Wagner. What's interesting is what he does with it. Theorists have sparred for decades over possible ways to interpret this chord, and each interpretation has its merits. Wagner used the leitmotif, a technique which associates characters and emotions with specific themes. The opening of the prelude is the confluence of the Leidensmotif, the suffering motif, depicting sadness by its expressive rise of a sixth and a chromatic descent. The other is a motif that represents the awakening of desire. Consider that chromaticism is often used to mean different things depending on the direction it's going. Upwards chromaticism, like we see in the line starting on G sharp, is about love. Descending chromaticism is about death. The opera's climax is literally a love-death scene, and we're getting a sneak preview here. While I've highlighted the augmented sixth here as usual, the ambiguity is about what the chord tones are. The argument that this is based off of the French sixth hinges on the ability to explain this long G sharp as an appoggiatura, that is a non-chord tone. This is reinforced by the accented passing A sharp on the downbeat of the next measure, which is clearly a non-harmonic tone, also on the downbeat. And if you interpret it as one anyway, guess what? It's an enharmonic French sixth. Plus, the augmented sixth typically goes to the dominant, and since we get a dominant seventh, that's the argument for this being an embellished French sixth. Plus, in context, the French sixth pops up a good deal elsewhere in Tristan, so the holistic view of the opera is part of the argument. But the most fascinating thing about this passage is how it luxuriates in dissonance, incorrectly resolving the augmented sixth and ending the phrase on an unresolved dissonance. The French sixth's surge in popularity, as the Romantic era progressed, is evidence of the decreasing hold of tonality, since the French sixth is the only one of the 3 major varieties to be recognizable by the way it sounds, not just a combination of sound and function. But the theoretical roots of the French sixth, as a result, hadn't been as thoroughly explored. Tchaikovsky and Walter Piston both believed, at least initially, that the French sixth wasn't a type of predominant chord, but rather an altered dominant achieved by flattening the fifth, retaining a common tone with the Neapolitan chord. It took until 1911 for a major theorist, Arnold Schoenberg, himself an enormously influential composer, to propose the idea that augmented sixths, since they are non-diatonic, fall under a blanket category of vagrant chords, even if he still thought of them as massively messed up two chords, which makes sense. No standard scalar collection of Western theory naturally contains the notes needed to build an augmented sixth. So he lumps it into the chapter with augmented triads and diminished sevenths, which share the same quality. They're only available if you're using the whole chromatic scale. And that's basically where this theory is today. But are these three the only possible augmented sixths? Of course not. Let's look at some more complicated ones. Because augmented sixths exist as a family of chords with a similar function, it's not uncommon to find composers inventing their own along the way. If we go by the basic formula of Italian sixth plus one other note, there are 7 other possible augmented sixth chords that as yet do not have names. Of course, no one is stopping you from writing a 5-note chord, no one is making you include scale degree 1 either. The 5-7 sharp 5 from earlier is one example. One enterprising Australian, named Alexander Bernard, called it the Australian sixth, which, nice try, buddy. I get the impulse. You learn that these geographical names don't mean anything, and the first thing you want to do is get your own country some representation. In honor of this randomness, I've used a website that gives you a random country to label these remaining chords because I can. I give you the Azeri, Moldovan, Senegalese, Grenadian, Zambian, Polish, and Bruneian sixths. All of these could be used, and I'm not going to go through all of them. Some are more practical than others. Good spelling is important, but it's not a deal breaker. The Azeri sixth either has to have A flat in A or B double flat in C. Neither of those are pretty to look at, although it sounds neat. The resolution is sort of the mirror image of the German sixths. The one that I've named the Senegalese sixth has a similar resolution, but it keeps scale degree 7 present throughout the whole process. Adding the mediant is a really great choice, I think. You have this whole tone voice leading, so it's got a very similar character to the French, and while you lose the common tone of the French sixth, when combined with its resolution, you imply an entire scale. I've called this the Zambian sixth, but I think the Luxembourgish sixth might be a better name for it, since it's got the whole toniness of the French, and it goes through the cadential sixth floor like the German. Adding scale degree 5, the Bruneian sixth, undercuts the tension of the dissonance. You really don't get the same effect of the resolution if the goal tone of the resolution is present throughout the whole process. One of the more common misconceptions is that the augmented sixth and the tritone substitution are precisely the same thing. They're not, but they are kind of related, so it's worth talking about them real quick. Tritone substitutions are common across a lot of music, especially jazz, and exploit the fact that while there are 12 possible dominant 7th chords on the piano, there are only 6 distinct tritones, meaning that any given tritone will have 2 potential dominant 7ths associated with it. Remember what I said about spelling earlier? This is the only way to distinguish between the two. The tritone from G to D flat resolves in A flat. But spell it from G to C sharp and it resolves in D. So for any 7th chord, you can exploit the inharmonic relationship between its tritone and the tritone from another dominant 7th, the tritone away. The resulting keys that you will cadence into will be a tritone away, and the other notes in the chord will be a tritone away from one another as well. This works because the tritone is the most crucial part of the chord. It's like the engine in a car. So if you're cadencing in D, note that the tritone sub for 5-7 is inharmonic to a German sixth built a tritone away from the dominant, that is to say flat 2, or our old friend the Neapolitan. The tritone substitution isn't usually as worried about spelling as augmented sixths are, so you can kind of think of it as its quick and dirty cousin. The resolution to the octave, at the end of the day, sounds the same. Throughout history, this chord has gone by many names and seen many creative uses, and while it's eminently explainable from a horizontal perspective, it's eluded theorists who want to rationalize it vertically. To this day, it's the one type of chord that doesn't get a proper Roman numeral in Roman numeral analysis. I would once again like to thank my patrons who support me monthly and help make this show possible. I'd also like to shout out Mark Ellis, author of the book on Augmented Sixths mentioned earlier, which came in super handy. Details down there in the doobly-doo. I definitely recommend tracking down a copy if you're really interested in the nitty-gritty. Last but not least, big thanks to YouTube documentarians John Boyce and Bobby Broccoli for pioneering and explaining how to do these Google Earth animations, respectively. It was very tedious, and I'm glad to be done, and I'm probably never going to do a video in this style ever again, just because it took so bloomin' long. But I hope you enjoyed this one.